Members, if you will turn to page 82, then we will go on to item 14, which is the Improvement of Council Tax and Business Rates Projected Collection Fund Surplus Deficit for 2016-17. And Mr Green, it's to you, please.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. We maintain a collection fund for the purpose of collecting both council tax and business rates. We collect about £90 million of council tax, about 60 million of business rates. And what the collection fund does is account for all the money coming in from council tax and business rate payers, and then account for it going out again. And of course, with both council tax and business rates, we hand over a good proportion of what we collect, with council tax to the preceptors, with business rates to Kent County Council, the Fire Authority and the government. And we keep the money in two separate pots in the collection fund. So we've got a council tax amount and a business rates amount. Now, this report arises because we always have to estimate at the beginning of the financial year what we expect to collect in order to prepare a budget, but we always have a deficit or a surplus at the end of the year because we can never project 100% accurately what we will actually collect. And the recommendations on page 82 actually need to be corrected because it talks about distribution of a surplus in relation to council tax, which is correct, but unfortunately we have a deficit in relation to business rates. So if I can ask members to just change that in the recommendation. And the details are probably most easily seen if you look at pages 88 and 89. And on page 88, you've got the position for council tax. And the key number to focus on is in the first of the boxes, about 2/3 of the way down the page, where we have a surplus on council tax that we're projecting at the moment at the end of the year. Now, historically, we've tended to have surpluses on the council tax side of the collection fund because the number of residences is growing all the time, and so at the end of last year we had a surplus of 747,000. At the moment it's looking as though we have an in-year deficit on council tax, but we are still only 6 months into the year, and it may be that in the remainder of the year the number of new homes will catch up and we'll move into the black. But anyway, at the moment we're projecting a deficit in year. Doesn't matter because we've still got that 747,000 brought forward from the beginning of the year. So at the moment we're saying that we'll have a surplus at the end of the year of 341,000, of which 55,972 will come to Maidstone, and that will help us for the budget for 17-18. That'll be a bit of extra money that we've got just for that, for the year 17-18 to balance next year's budget. So that's the position on council tax, a surplus of which we will get 55,972. Turning to the next page on business rates, it's the other way round. And what's happened there is that at the end of 2015-16, we had a very large deficit of 9.5 million. And the reason that this came about was that we hadn't projected this, but what happened was that a whole lot of appeals were raised against business rates valuations. And if an appeal is raised, we have to assume that we're not actually going to be able to collect the money from the business rate payer. Now, of course, over time, the appeals are processed and we find out what the position is. And often the position isn't as bad as it appears at first sight, because business rate payers will often appeal just in order to maximise their chances of getting a reduction in their valuation. But that was the position that we were faced with at the beginning of the year, of a 9.5 million deficit. Some of that has been clawed back in the course of 16-17, so we're currently projecting a surplus for 16-17 of 3814887, because as appeals are processed, the position hasn't turned out to be quite as bad as, from our point of view, as we might have expected. We have had some successes with appeals, but we're still looking at a deficit on business rates of 5.7 million, and the box at the bottom shows how that's shared out. So we have to bear 2.2 million of that. Now, we did set money aside for that when we were closing the accounts at the end of last year, so that's not added to the in-year deficit that we're facing, but there's nonetheless a deficit that we have to account for here. So what the report is doing is asking for you to approve the distribution of the surplus in relation to council tax and the deficit in relation to business rates. I'm happy to answer any questions that members have to clarify, if I can, anything on the detail here. Thank you.
Councillor Harper.
Just so I understand, obviously, in terms of this deficit on page 89, just under £2.3 million we've got to pick up. I was trying to see if I could sort of link it back to the quarterly budget monitoring report we did earlier when we were looking at the reserves, and I couldn't quite. How does that relate to the reserves that we've got on page 18 of our £14.3 million, and then those adjustments there? Is it on top of all of that, or is it within that, or what's the actual impact to the council? Some are presumably we're losing £2.25 million, aren't we?
The answer is that it doesn't affect the reserves position because the collection fund is a completely separate fund from the general fund. So it is accounted for separately. The way that it impacts the general fund is that the general fund ultimately will get the benefit of our share of council tax and business rates. But at the moment, this report is just looking at a surplus or a deficit in the collection fund. It's a completely separate fund, and so that doesn't impact directly the general fund, which were the figures that were reported in the report you had earlier this evening.
Okay, I can understand they're separate. They're sort of separate items, but surely there's some linkage, because somewhere there's going to be £2.3 million less cash for Maidstone Borough Council, or less than £55,000 on the other page. So that has to somehow come through to us at some point over the next year or so. And I'm just trying to understand, is it going to mean that on top of all the budget cuts we're looking at, the £4.5 million, there's another £2 million, or is it going to come out of, will it ultimately come out of reserves, or £25 million of cash, or somehow? But surely it has to at some point come through to the council books.
Mr. Green.
The business rates deficit has been dealt with as part of closing the accounts for 15-16, because what we did then was we looked at what business rates we could expect to credit to the general fund, and we could see at that stage that we weren't going to get all of the business rates that were in the original projection at the head of the page. So it has been accounted for in closing the accounts for 15-16, and when you see the figures for 16-17 budget setting, you'll see again an estimate for business rates in the income that's coming into the general fund, but we will make a reasonable assumption about what business rates income we can include for 17-18 when we're setting the budget for next year.
Just once more.
So we wrote off the anticipated deficit at the end of last financial year is what you're saying. Okay, I understand that. So presumably, if as a result of all the appeals you were saying, which are going through, that some of them end up, I suppose, coming on our side of the argument, okay, so we can collect some money, which we assumed we wouldn't. At some point, that would be, if you like, extra money going into our, well, either our reserves or whatever we chose to do at the relevant point when we could clarify that. Would that be fair to say?
That's correct. And if some of that deficit were to reverse, it would come through in next year's version of this report, and that would be money that could be credited to the general fund. I mean, there's a general point here about business rates income, which is, as I think you can see from this report, it is very volatile because the way that so many business rates valuations are subject to appeal, and it doesn't make it very difficult to project what we can expect to get from business rates. And I mean, thinking a bit more widely, the government is saying that we'll get 100% of business rates income. I mean, it may not be as much as 100%, but that will just increase the level of volatility that we face in our financial projections. What a lot of councils, we included, would like to see is a root and branch reform of the valuation system and the way that appeals are processed, but that's still some way off.
All right, Councillor Burr.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to move the recommendations as per the papers, because I think this is a fairly academic accounting exercise that we're overlooking this evening, so I'd move the recommendations per the papers.
Can I just say, with the amendment to item 2, where the word surplus becomes
yes,
deficit?
With that correction as stated. Having said that, may I ask a direct question? Am I correct in saying there is an imminent revaluation for business rates? And that being the case, it will therefore follow that there will be a massive tranche of new appeals, which will probably mean a very significant accrual for future years. And I just wondered how we need to face that, perhaps in the context of the things Councillor Harper was saying.
That's absolutely right, Councillor Burton. There'll be a new rating list from 1st of April 2017, and we've already got the figures for what the proposed new valuations are, and there's winners and losers, and not surprisingly, the losers will be likely to appeal. So yes, that does introduce further uncertainty into the position.
Councillor Burton moved the recommendations. Is that seconded? Thank you, Councillor Harper. So I think we move straight to a vote. Can I take the 2 together then in that case? Thank you. So please, will you give a show of hands if you agree the recommendations? Subject to the change. Yes, subject to the change. I think that is unanimous. Thank you very much. And now we move to agenda item 15, which is on page 90 of your papers. Before I ask Mr McGuinness to come in, just for those who weren't here at the last meeting, can I just say that we discussed this at great length and specific questions were asked, which was why it went back to officers. So hopefully the questions will be answered tonight to everybody's satisfaction. But what I must point out is that this is our final decision, which is a recommendation regarding going to full council. And to hit that deadline, we do have to make a decision tonight. So I would ask everybody to be as disciplined as we can be when we're discussing this. And so over to you, Mr McInnes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. At the meeting on the 26th of October, members deferred a decision on the future council tax reduction scheme, requesting further information. The report before you tonight has been updated to include that information, which is specifically a more detailed breakdown of the impact of changes, which is now shown within Appendix A, a comparison with other Kent districts provided as Appendix E within your papers, details of the cumulative impact of the changes, and consideration of any unintended consequences with specific concerns raised with regards to housing, and a review of the recommendations to reflect the kind of general concerns shown by members as to the impact. The revised recommendations made within the report reflect those concerns, with two of the options withdrawn, those options relating to a limit on the backdating of claims and changes to include child maintenance within the calculation. If I can invite any questions.
I had Councillor Burton first.
Thank you, Chair. And I apologise because I'm only a substitute on this committee, so I've not followed the build-up debate. I think it was that last point that Mr McGuinness mentioned there that concerns me most is the option 8 one of not taking into account child maintenance. Whilst I understand the sentiment of the reasoning to reject that, in some instances that may be a significant amount of money, and it appeared that we were ignoring that possibility. So I apologise for not having been involved in the debate to date, but that's the one that concerns me, especially as we have the caveat at option 13 for exceptional hardship cases.
Mr McGuinness, did you just briefly want to say how we arrived at that point?
Okay, yeah, certainly. That option was withdrawn on the basis of concerns that were kind of evident in relation to child poverty. A number of the changes impact on families with children, a number of the kind of national welfare reforms, and the consideration was that by adding further to that impact on families with children, we could increase the number of children in poverty.
Thank you. Councillor Burton, I think I will say that I think we need to be completely open here, that there was a discussion with the 5 leaders who said, in view of what they knew of the councillors that they represent, if I can put it that way, that this was a major concern of people in relation to child poverty. And so, I mean, it's for everybody to make up their own mind, but there seemed to be a general agreement that this was perhaps a step too far. And also, if you looked at it in relation to Kent as a whole, I'm not suggesting that that should be our lodestone or our yardstick, but if you did look at Kent as a whole, the councils that took it into account were very much in the minority. Councillor Garland, I have you next.
As a friendly critic of this particular approach last time round, I think the changes or the further information has been made has clarified a number of issues I think were expressed at that particular meeting. And with some of the items that have been removed, I think this is not a better paper, because the previous paper was very good, but it just clarified a few extra points. So with that, I would move the recommendations on the paper, because we did debate this rather well and in depth last time. And I think, given what was said, that's by and large, if not all of it, been taken on board tonight.
Thank you. I'm not going to ask if it's seconded yet, because I have Councillor Blackmore indicating, and I think... Oh, no, but I did have Councillor Blackmore before you. So I think I will go to Councillor Blackmore, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr McGuinness, for the update. I think on page 93, 2.11 is quite a useful point to note, because it shows the different options that other councils have considered. Now, I think the chairman is right. We shouldn't be blindly led. And there was no doubt in my mind when we had a group leaders meeting about 3-4 weeks ago, and we were looking at the range of options. One option I think we were quite unhappy with related to the backdating, to limit it to 1 month, because it appeared from the figures that we had in front of us that those with a disability appeared to be unfairly discriminated against. Now, I'm not sure whether that's the case, but I think looking at the figures, I would be happy to go in line with something that simplifies what we have and is also in line with the other welfare changes that are happening nationally, but with the caveat of taking out option 3, So that would leave us with option 1, which is universal, option 2, option 5, option 11 and option 12, as per 2.11 on page 93, but taking out option 3, which is the element of backdating. And if anyone wants me to say that again, I'd be very happy to.
I think it would help Mrs. Matthews if you said it again. So if you would go through that, just once more, read that out.
Okay. So on page 93, 2.11, looking at the options which the majority of councils across Kent have gone with, they've accepted option 1, which reduces the maximum support to 80%. Option 2, removing the family premium for new applicants, new working applicants. Option 5, removing the period for which a person could be absent from Great Britain and still receive council tax reduction to 4 weeks. Although we never actually quantified the number of individuals that affected, but didn't seem that fair. Option 11, removal of the work-related activity component, and option 12, limiting the number of dependent children to 2, although I think that's only effective from April next year. Any children born after April next year, am I right in saying that they wouldn't be, or they would be excluded?
Born from the 1st of April, third child born with a date of birth after the 1st of April.
So does that help, Madam Chairman?
It does, and I'm happy to second that from the chair. But I still have other people to speak. So I have Councillor McLaughlin next, and then Councillor Harper indicated.
But I haven't finished yet, Madam Chairman. My other concern relates to, I think, Medway Council, who have looked at 35% reduction, whereas we're looking at 20%. I think it would be helpful, bearing in mind the pressure on our budgets, to consider, and I'm not saying we should do it, I'm just saying consider it, further changes for the following year, which would be effective from 2018. But I think the only way we can do that is to follow the same procedure that we have this year and go out to consultation again, and maybe look at a range of figures from 22.5 up to, I don't know, 27.5 to get a feel for what the general appetite is. But I think at the end of the day, this is about fairness.
I didn't say it, but I'm reserving my right to speak, having seconded it. I'll come in at the end. Sorry, who did I say I had next? Councillor... no, it was Councillor McLaughlin, yes.
It's Mr. Invisible again.
No, far from it.
I just want to pick up on option 12, which was just discussed, and the point was made that this doesn't come into effect until the 1st of April. Now, it's actually, if you look on page 106, it is actually quite a heavy impact if you restrict the number of children to 2. Now, I think in bringing about this introduction, we are only talking about additional children that are born after the 1st of April. Now, I would like to suggest that whether one has a child, the decision of having another child won't be totally influenced by this, but I think parents, prospective parents, should be made aware of this change before conception, if I may put it that way. And therefore, I think, in the interest of fairness, I would suggest that we should make this effective at a minimum of 10 months after public announcement of this change. I'm glad you find that amusing, Councillor Harper. It does make a difference of £427.96 and that's to all families, poor and not so poor. So I put that forward. I'd welcome the officer's response. The other is a point of clarification. On page 94, it is stated that the proposed changes, as recommended, presumably, have an impact of 133,000 per annum. The total on page 106 is shown as 876,619. And I just want verification as to how you've gone from that figure to the 133,000 as being Maidstone's share of the precept. Thank you.
Thank you. With regards to the kind of first point about the 9 months delay, it's certainly within your remit to kind of set the rule if that's what you'd like to do to delay its implementation. The only thing I would say is we started consulting regarding these changes in July, so we have given some advance notice that it's being considered, and it does mirror what's happening in the wider welfare system. So there is a general awareness that the government and welfare system is looking to introduce these changes. It's not something that Maidstone Borough Council were looking to do in isolation in terms of the principle. So I think there may be a reasonable awareness of that change already. In terms of the 133,000, I mean, that's based on the council share of the precept. So I haven't got my working papers with me in terms of the exact percentage, but that's the basis of that figure.
Do you wish to come back?
Well, I think the officer's confirmed it would be possible to meet my requirements. I take his point that consultation has started in July. But nevertheless, if we're taking the same stance on the other application regarding children, I think we should be consistent, and it's a small price to pay for showing some compassion. I put it to the committee whether you'd support me on that.
Can you just repeat precisely what you're asking us to do? Again, please.
Well, I think the officer summed it up and said we would introduce option, was it 8? From the 2nd... 12, sorry, 12. From 2nd of August, you said, did you? You did. You said the 2nd of August. If that meets my requirements, it might be the 2nd of September. I don't know, I haven't done the sums, but... When is this going to be made public?
On the 7th of December, the council will make its decision. The individual notifications won't go out to households in receipt of benefit until March. But there will be a general announcement in terms of the press. We will publish the decision following the meeting of full council on the 7th of December.
I'm going to move to... No, I do need to bottom this one out. I think that now is not the appropriate time to complicate this. It has got to go to full council. And I think that as put by Councillor Blackmore, that, and as it's written out at option 12, is acceptable at this point in time. You may wish to raise it at full council and see what is said there.
With respect, Chair, I think the committee should be asked whether they wish to support me on this and have a vote on it.
A show of hands for those who do wish to... yes, sorry. Have we got anybody seconding that?
We're already on an amendment.
Yes, but we need to go to... We need to go, yes,
you need to deal with the amendment that you're...
Annabelle's first. Yes, exactly. Sorry. Councillor Harper.
Thank you. I mean, this whole issue is rather distasteful. It's obviously an impact of the government's national austerity processes coming through in terms of the impacts on welfare and the most vulnerable in our country. But given that we have to do something because of the changes in all the benefits going through, what I'm not clear on is when you look at pages 94, 95 and 96, it lists out the areas where they were being recommended tonight to implement or reject. And it was obviously showing 2 items number 3 and number 8 to reject. I just want to clarify that we're now looking to reject also. Is it 4, 6, 7, 9 and 10? Because I thought what was moved was we would go with options 1, 2, 3, 5, 11 and 12. I'm just a bit unclear in my mind as to which of those we're actually going with, if we accept the amendment.
Mr McGuinness, do we need to just run through and make it absolutely clear what is in and what is out?
Apologies. So in terms of options that would be included, so if we kind of run through them. So option 1, the percentage change will be included. Option 2, the removal of the family premium would be included. Option 3, we would be rejecting. Option 4, we would be rejecting. Option
I think, Councillor Blackmore, you might be going to say what I was going to ask you if you would also accept within your...
Option 13
yes,
for the
option
hardship
13.
scheme, because I think we can't ignore that at all.
So if that's what we go with, what's the impact of that in terms of the figure of £133,000 in 3.3? I'm just trying to understand. The more of this we can reject, that I personally would think is a good idea, given what I said earlier. I just want to understand what is the sort of impacts on the council of doing it, because obviously whilst I'm against having to do any of this, I've also, like everybody else here, we've got to think about our £4 million gap on the other side. So I'm just trying to understand the impacts of this in terms of those projected savings.
Okay, thank you. So the initial recommendation would look to reduce the cost of the council tax reduction scheme by $870,000. If we implemented the options that have been discussed, subject to what we might decide to set aside for the hardship scheme, that would reduce the cost of the scheme by $480,000. So in terms of what that means in terms of the council's share, that would be a difference of £60,000 a year in terms of impact for the council between the two options.
Councillor Harper.
Okay, so am I right then, where we say in paragraph 3.3 it was going to be a £133,000 contribution to our savings. We can basically take £60,000 off, so this would be a contribution of the balance to it, yeah? Just so I'm quite clear. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Garland.
And for clarity, so that 60,000 that we just arrived at is then subject to whatever we allow for option 13. So it could disappear to nothing if we said we'll allow 60 for that. I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Option 13, the cost of that would be split with the precepting authorities. So it would be our share of that. So I can't imagine it will be anywhere near the region of 60,000, but if it was 10,000, for example, the cost to us would be approximately kind of £1,500.
Are we saying we need to set a budget for that, or we make that up as we go along later? I'm a bit lost there.
I'd be looking to bring a separate report to the committee with a draft scheme for the committee to consider, and then at that point I'd make a recommendation as to the budget.
Councillor Blackmore, will you accept that we add option 13 to what you have recommended?
I think it would be appropriate to do so. Yes, please.
Thank you. On that, then, I'm going to a vote on what has been proposed by Councillor Blackmore, seconded by myself. Will those in favour please show? Yours comes afterwards. So that is... Yes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 13, yes. Those against? Those abstaining? 1. So that is carried. If you choose, Councillor McLaughlin, you can now propose your amendment to, I think, okay, yes.
Thank you. My amendment to option 12 is simply that it should be coming into effect, deferred to a period 10 months after the public announcement of the new schemes. Whatever date that is, and if the officer can tell us what that date is, then we can put that date in.
Did
September,
you get
1st of September? Thank you. Right, that's my proposal, that option 12 is implemented only after the 2nd of September.
I have Councillor Harvey indicating and Councillor Blackmore. I want to second it.
Without meaning to be difficult, if we bring in something mid-term, what sort of, I don't know, IT issues or other complications does it create from a processing point of view, if any?
From a processing point of view, I think there's something that we could cope with in terms of change. For the customer, it does mean that in terms of the explanation of their benefit, they would in effect have 2 different benefit awards with different calculations for each period. So it does enter a complication for the customer, although it's something that we could operationally deal with.
Right. Councillor English.
I mean, just very briefly, clearly you just said you could cope with that. It's not, and that's good to know. But in terms of ballpark figures, I know it's often as long as how long's a piece of string, but clearly if you're doing 2 separate awards, that could have a cost implication. Is it significant or is it very marginal?
I think the cost would be marginal in terms of the administration cost.
Good, I'm just checking because we don't want to, give with one hand and take away with the other.
Right. All right, Councillor Burton, yours is the final word.
I just wanted to say, I think aspirationally this is very fine thinking. The reality of this being understood, the news reaching those that are likely to be affected by it, I think is quite slim, and we're adding what isn't an insignificant complication to the administration. So it's a fine intent, but I don't see that it's practically going to make much difference.
All right. We have this proposed by Councillor McLaughlin, seconded by Councillor Harvey. Those in favour, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those against? 1, 2, 3, 4, 7. So that is lost. Can I just reiterate that what we have said tonight is not our final decision, but it is a recommendation to full council.
May I just query if that was recorded correctly, because I was abstaining there. I didn't hear that called. You didn't ask for an abstention.
Can we just do that again then, please? 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Against? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yes, my maths is faulty. And an abstention? 1. Thank you for pointing it out. Can we move then to the last item, which is agenda item 16 on page 157?
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
And before we do, Can I just point out that we had amended papers, which do you all have a copy? Because we do have some spares here. So everybody, no? So just a moment while we make sure everybody does have a copy.
Well done, Steve.
So you're going to arrive swiftly tomorrow?
So I might have a line.
Members, can I just say that if you want to blame anybody for having this new report, you can blame me, because when I looked at the original, I thought that things to note and actual decisions were rather mixed up and weren't in a very clear state. So that was requested, and also Councillor Blackmore pointed out that one of the little tables was so small it was difficult to see, so hopefully it's rather larger now and more easily understandable. So with that, Mr Cornell.
Okay, thanks again. The current 5-year strategy was adopted in the summer of 2014, so we're now at the halfway point, so it's an appropriate time for a review. The report that you've read evaluates the success of the various commercial initiatives undertaken under the banner of the strategy, and the areas of notable success have been shared services, business improvement and commissioning, commercial and garden waste and grounds maintenance, and property investment. And I think it's fair to say there have been areas of difficulty too. Some of the smaller low-margin activities have been rather intensive in management input and slow to become profitable. Also, whilst capital projects in general have presented lots of opportunities, it's fair to say that the delivery has been slower than we would have liked on occasion. But moving forward, our conclusions are that the property investment activity should be ramped up and focused largely on housing and regeneration type projects. Furthermore, rather than acquiring existing income and generating assets, we'd be better served by developing our own assets so that we can capture the developer's profit and also the regeneration effect of putting up new buildings too. So what we're proposing is that the thrust of the strategy would be to develop housing-led sites whereby broadly a third of the homes developed would be for market rent to be held within our new company, Maidstone Property Holdings. A third would be to be delivered for market sale housing, perhaps through our developer contractor partner, but obviously Maidstone could choose to take some risk in this area of operation too, perhaps through joint venture, and that might be worthy of some discussion as we go through. And finally, typically a third of all the sites we develop will have a third affordable housing on there, and that money will come in through a development, through a housing association partner, and deliver affordable housing through that route. So to be clear, I'm not proposing that we get into building affordable housing. There's housing associations out there that can better geared up to do that than we are now. But what we would be creating is our own market rent portfolio within Maidstone Property Holdings to generate a long-term profitable revenue stream and an appreciating asset base. This approach marries with us being a long-term strategic organisation, and one of our key sort of competitive advantages is that we can borrow money at extremely cheap rates for long-term periods. So that puts us in a good place to invest in market-rented housing. The table at 2.14 is purely for illustration, but it shows that were we to invest, say, a figure of 50 million, It would fund a portfolio of around 250 market rent homes that would yield a net revenue surplus of around 750k per annum. And by my sort of estimations, it would take around 5 years to build a portfolio of this size. In addition to our own developments, the Council could also set aside a revolving fund whereby we purchase key sites, create planning, certainty and betterment, and then sell on those sites at a profit to external development partners to take forward. This is the approach that really we're putting into play at Maidstone East at the moment, but it could be used for sites of different sizes all the way down to delivering rural exception sites in parishes. In the very short term, we're also proposing an intensive burst of expenditure on temporary accommodation to deal with the budgetary issues that we're sort of facing and talked about earlier in the meeting today. And that will be dealt with in a separate paper that will come to the Communities, Housing and Environment Committee next month. But really, that is a short-term burst of activity to get us up to a more appropriate size of portfolio for temporary accommodation. Really, the thrust of what we're saying in this strategy is that we want to invest in market-rented housing because that will provide the long-term sort of asset base and revenue stream that fits with the type of organisation the Council is. So I've put various recommendations there, which might be helpful just to give some consider, and I'd happily take any questions on the paper.
Thank you. Councillor Harper was first.
I'd like to move all the recommendations on page 157. I think this is a very good report, and I think it's moving us in the right direction. I mean, we spoke earlier of this £25 million of cash, which is losing its value. If we can start to do some of this stuff fairly quick, as fast as obviously is practical, then we're safeguarding our cash, we're developing revenue streams for ourselves for the future, and we're providing housing. So it seems to hit all of our core needs as a council. So, I suggest we just get on with it as quickly as we can.
Is that seconded? Councillor Blackmore, and you were indicating next.
I think Councillor Harper said what I was going to say, but just to add to it, bearing in mind, I think we've got issues homelessness, and Mr Cornwall's highlighted the temporary accommodation issue as well. It's my personal opinion. I think this is something the Council should be doing a lot more of.
Thank you. I think that we have to be careful with this committee we are talking about a strategic plan for finances overall. I think we all share your sentiment, but that is more appropriate to go to the other committee, the Communities Committee. It's just to make the differentiation between the two things. And I have Councillor English next.
I hear what you say, Madam Chairman, but I'm not entirely 100% in agreement. I think Councillor Blackmore is right, that given the situation where we are with housing need, that albeit not from this committee's point of view, we do have to be aware that that housing need has a very serious, as the discussion earlier, financial strategic implication. This council, like many other councils, would not necessarily choose this particular business strategy given a free hand, because given a free hand and a lack of government regulations and changes, we might possibly have chosen to invest in the housing market and property market in a different way. But given the restrictions and policy changes that came about just after the last election, it's quite clear that some options have been closed off. Therefore, from a purely financial point of view, these are the options we're left with in terms of property and housing. So strategically, to protect our interests and the council's balance sheet and the residents of the borough, businesses of the borough, we do have to adopt this strategy. But we should also I think Councillor Harper was seeing it this way, as an opportunity to do something we probably should have been doing before the housing crisis became so pressing, and this is a strategy we probably should have been looking towards many years ago, as many far-sighted local authorities have done. Clearly, it's become even more pressing with the pressure on local government funding, but to actually take the burden off council taxpayers and business rate payers and to actually generate income going forward must be a very sensible way to go. I would just comment briefly on one and observe that in terms of the point the Chairman made about keeping committee responsibility separate, a couple of times in this report when we're looking at earlier strands of work, like the adventure zone and so on, where planning consent is required, the report does sort of read as if the assumptions are being made that planning committee will grant that consent. One should beware of assuming in a P&R report, which is about finance quite rightly, but another committee that is concerned about regulatory matters will necessarily grant that consent. And it really should have been put in contingent language for the avoidance of public doubt wherever that comes up. And I do think it's important that when we write reports like this, it is put in contingent language and say if consent is granted and so on, rather than just blandly assuming that regulatory committees will take the same view as finance and strategic committees. They don't necessarily.
I think we can note that, can't we? Thank you. Councillor McLaughlin, you...
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I wondered if the officer could just confirm that this strategy is not to the exclusion of investments in possible commercial opportunities.
Do you mean commercial property opportunities? Absolutely not. And I think most of the opportunities for us to develop housing are going to come in the town centre, and it's quite probable that these housing-led sites will have a commercial element to them, perhaps at ground floor in an urban location. So it will present us an opportunity to build our commercial property portfolio too, but that rather being a means to an end. I think the thrust of it is residential, but it will lead to some further investment in commercial property too.
Can I just ask here, just for clarification too, before somebody else asks, it does not also close down opportunities if something that we already do, we find an opportunity to actually profit from it. Can we just confirm?
Yes, I think it's important to have a strategy, but it's got to be flexible enough, hasn't it, to adjust to changing conditions and opportunities as well.
Councillor Garland, next.
Yeah, I think this is to be welcomed. I want to make 2 points. Firstly, I think whilst the returns are 1.5% after debt and costs have been taken into account, of itself isn't that attractive. When you actually look at the pound note revenue contributions that will make, they are indeed quite significant and will no doubt go to a long way towards assisting us with the £4.7 million we've got to find over the next 5 years, if it is, and I'm sure it will be successful. I think Councillor English has been a bit too precious about his comments about contingency. I suspect that would go without saying. We obviously have officers who will be able to make the necessary planning measures to ensure that they would become acceptable, certainly from a regulatory point of view, to the planning committee. So I don't have any fears on the point that Councillor English makes. But I just also wanted to comment on the actual wider commercialisation developments that have occurred. Clearly, as has been said, it hasn't always hit target, but I think it's important to note that of the commercial projects we have, avoiding the temporary accommodation ones for the present, that has actually brought in a significant revenue contribution to the council. So, for instance, 2015-16 brought in £605,000 worth of revenue to the council, although it's indicated in red, local government works slightly differently. And 2016-17 brought in 543. So I think the commercialisation strategy, some people poo-poo it, but I think is generally something that is of significant financial contribution to this council, and we should, along with a number of recommendations we've made, look to expand that where possible, and certainly with our comparative advantage in garden refuse collection, focus needs to be made on that, because that's where we've generated the most revenue and had the most success. So it makes sense to focus on that and to innovate further where possible. I think given that we're also talking about an overall housing strategy that will deliver not only the yield in financial terms, but also that social premium as well, I think it's also worth noting that the temporary accommodation that we've already delivered, both at Aylesbury House and Magnolia House, have avoided temporary accommodation costs, quite significant ones, certainly in 2015-16 nearly 300,000 and 2016-17 113. So I think, although it's not specifically to do with temporary accommodation, as I said earlier on a previous item, there is that lag time. Any opportunity we have to develop affordable housing in the way it's been proposed, I think should be welcomed. So, along with a financial return of 1.5% and the absolute pound note values that brings, and also the social premium that adds, and given the success we have had, because it is success, it generates an income, if you regard as a success, I think in general terms, I think the approach that's being taken is the right one.
Councillor Garland, that's music to my ears, because I remember all those years ago when I suggested we had to go down this route, the original comment to me was you're trying to take business away from our other businesses. I can see that you have been converted on the road to Damascus.
Oh, no, no, no. I started it.
Councillor Harwood.
Thank you, Chairman. I don't think we should lose sight that a key underpinning principle around the property development approach is not just profit and commercialisation, and it is not just providing more accommodation. I think we've got to have a greater vision than that. Because if you think, you know, to be kind of politically even-handed, if you think of the kind of Joe Chamberlain vision in the 19th century, if you think of the Home Fit for Heroes, kind of Lloyd George after First World War, if you think of the Attlee government after the Second World War, and the improvement quality of life that was brought through public sector investment in the housing, in terms of the size of rooms on the post-war housing estates, the sizes of the gardens, the high-quality open spaces, the good quality build, and then compare that with a lot of what the market is delivering now, with substandard size buildings, no gardens, nowhere to swing a cat or dry washing and so on. We are seeing a move away from, well, we saw the demise of COFA sustainable homes and the move to, you know, the part 13 of the building regs. You know, we have to buck that trend, and we can do that, and we can do it in a high-profile way. And all the problems we're having through planning committee, where we're having to put so much resource into enforcement, because even when we have conditions, those conditions are not being delivered. We can actually show with our kind of very competitive borrowing advantages that we can really deliver high quality in terms of places to live for people in this borough. So I don't think we should be kind of, you know, backwards and coming forwards, and ensuring that when we promote this approach, that we're doing it on quality of life and quality of development, and we've got a bigger vision than just getting a few quid in for the council. And I think that will be a catalyst to improving all private sector development that's going on in this borough.
Can I say that this, to my mind, is almost a first step? We agree which way we want to go, but I think this council will be looking for quality and excellence and quality of life for our residents. And I'm looking to our other chairmen who are sitting here tonight to actually make that happen through their service committees. So we have strategic planning, we have communities, and of course, although it's not a service committee, we have the planning committee itself. And I believe that there, again, I'm going to say I don't think there's a councillor that does not want to see the quality of homes that we produce improved and at the cutting edge of what a council can do, and not at the bog standard, I'm not saying that's where we are, but at the bog standard bottom edge of where we are. So I think I take what you have said very seriously, Councillor Harwood, and yes, we do have to ensure that that happens. I have Councillor Gooch next, and Councillor Burton has indicated again. Councillor Gooch.
Thank you, Chairman. Clarification, really. First of all, I certainly welcome this report. Excellent stuff. This is what we should be doing. But can you just confirm that there could be a danger here that we squeeze out some excellent initiatives? And I have in mind the pet crematorium. I know it's an awful lot of money, and yes, that we will be getting some kind of revised business plan, but it would be a great shame if we're saying, no, sorry, we're going to spend all that money on regeneration. As much as I want to see it, we can't miss out on other commercial stuff. So just reassure me on that. And the other item, I could be misreading it, but where you've got the preferred option, I haven't got the page number, the preferred option is 4.2 as being the only means by which MBC, and I'm looking at paragraph 5 and 5.1. Is the preferred option 4.2, or have I just lost the plot? It's not, you've written option 3.2, but it's not, is it? It's 4.2.
Yes, that's been good spot, and that was corrected in the paper that's been handed around this evening. And returning to your first point, you know, no, it's not a case of dropping all other commercial activities, but, you know, kind of acknowledging that, you know, with the financial pressures that the council's facing, being of a scale, you know, it needs to sort of pick a area of focus that can deliver on a scale proportionate to that. But
Councillor English. Oh, yes, Councillor Burton first, then Councillor English.
Thank you, Chair. So I'd like to just pick up your comments about implementation of this with quality, and I just think that's an absolute given that all branches, all arms of the council are going to be looking to deliver the very best that we can for residents and for our own investment portfolio. Off subject now, quality. I can't help but observe these microphones are doing funny things, and they're brand new, and I don't even know if we paid the bill yet, but perhaps we shouldn't until some of these things are resolved. We had problems at my committee recently. There was some confusion over the papers, so this isn't an amended agenda, is it?
It's not an amended agenda,
So
but there is a change in the way the recommendations
right,
have been laid out.
Yes,
but
so this is an urgent update.
No, this was discussed. It is not an urgent update. Otherwise, I would have said.
That just seems a little strange. Anyway, commenting on the subject at hand, I think excellent. Very pleased to see the last bullet point recommendation there about IT innovations around parking. I think there's a tremendous amount we can do there to boost revenue and improve the residents' experience. Just want to say that obviously pursuing a development portfolio, I'm sure we will be very careful not to dispose of all our parking assets that actually deliver us a very significant income, as we were seeing earlier on. So just a note of caution around that. Casting my eye down the list of the other commercial business that we have, there are some that concern me there. Top of the list is that Moat Park Cafe. This may not be the arena to get into the depths of that here. I'm very mindful of things that were brought forward to Audit Committee this week around that. So I really do hope that that is being scrutinised by officers in total detail. Pet crematorium, I see there's a further report around that. I have shared some alternative thoughts with officers concerning that, where there is the possibility of partnering with an existing provider. We could perhaps de-risk our element. I hope that has been captured and will come forwards. Don't tell the Chief Executive I said this, but I'm even warming to some of the shared services ideas after having heard some things today. But please don't tell her I said that.
We will be deaf to it. Deaf to it. Just to set your mind at rest, reports have gone to Heritage, Culture and Leisure on the items you're mentioning, and you can be, again, we have the chairman here who can assure you that what you have said is being looked at and with a fine-tooth comb. I will ask you, Councillor Pickett, if you did want to just say anything to respond to that.
Yes, I just wanted to assure Councillor Burton that we are working very hard on these schemes. They are, in some cases, slightly delayed, but we are on track to deliver. So, yes, and having given me a chance to speak, I was just thinking, a week or two ago, I went on a seminar about culture and leisure in local councils, and actually we are on the ball here, because the first note on the training session was commercial activity. All the councils are going down this road because of the situations we're in financially across the kingdom. So we're not alone, we're on the right track here, and all I want to say, actually following up from this, is I think we need to keep our commercial options open and look at every option that comes along our way, not just what we've got here tonight, because it's a generator of wealth and income. And if we get it right, it'll help some of our problems, shall I say. So, yes.
Thank you. Councillor English, I'm going to give you the last word, or almost the last word.
Well, I don't have to say very much because it's mostly been said. All I would say is that all commercialisation proposals should be considered, but they should only be embarked upon if there's a robust business case made and a robust timetable for an assessment of outcomes, and that has often been the case, but not exclusively the case. So we need to be careful about that. Just one plea. We're putting the emphasis on housing as the key element of regeneration. I think that's correct. But in a town like Maidstone, like many others, there will be opportunities where commercial development is not just a subsidiary part of housing development, but is actually quite possibly the main driver. And I wouldn't want us to overlook that if we're going forward. We may need to actually have schemes that are mainly commercial, whether that's office or retail or a combination of both, rather than housing-led, and those occasions will occur.
I think that's been taken on board. All right, we're going to move to a vote on this. Just to recap, so everybody's very, very clear. The report as such has not changed. It was merely the front page where to note and what was the decision were sort of muddled up together. So I asked for it to be laid out. If you've got your original papers, you will see there was just one point and the bullet points were sort of subsumed into it. So I asked that we had it redone so that the first one is to note. So I'm going to ask you now if you do note the first item here. And thank you. And the new two, if you like, which has been moved by Councillor Harper and seconded by Councillor Blackmore, is that the strategy be refocused to the following areas. Are you happy to take that as a collective? So may I have a show of hands then, please, for those in agreement? And that is unanimous. Thank you very much. With that, I will say that the meeting is closed. she's not going to like it, but I'm going to say that Mrs. Broom's birthday was today, so this is a duty call beyond expected. And I would also say, Councillor Borton, I commend you for hanging in there when you're clearly suffering. so safe journey home, everybody.